The automatic doors had barely finished sliding shut before the first rifle struck the reception counter hard enough to crack its edge, sending clipboards, pens, and the last illusion of safety skidding across the polished floor. A little boy waiting with a fever buried his face against his mother's shoulder. An elderly man froze halfway through signing discharge papers, and every conversation inside the emergency department dissolved into frightened silence as 6 mercenaries in black tactical gear spread through the room with terrifying precision. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as if nothing extraordinary had happened, monitors continued their relentless beeping behind half-closed curtains, and the sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the cold smell of rain that drifted in through the entrance each time the wind pushed against the shattered calm. The leader removed his soaked gloves one finger at a time, revealing scarred knuckles and a faded tattoo curling around his wrist, a symbol so old and weathered that almost no one noticed it except the woman standing beside bed 7. Evelyn Harper had worked the night shift for nearly 17 years, long enough to recognize the sounds of panic before people themselves realized they were afraid. She noticed the trembling hands of a young intern pretending to organize supplies, the physician quietly moving children behind a medication cart, the security guard lying unconscious near the entrance after making the mistake of trying to stop armed professionals, and the unconscious man whose blood-soaked jacket had arrived only 20 minutes earlier after a mysterious highway crash. While everyone else stared at the guns, Evelyn kept watching people. She always believed fear revealed more than words ever could. Her navy blue scrubs carried the wrinkles of a long shift, her identification badge swung gently against her chest whenever she moved, and her tired eyes carried the quiet patience that only years of comforting strangers could create. The wounded patient had been brought in without identification, his pulse weak but steady, his injuries strangely inconsistent with an ordinary traffic accident. Deep bruises circled both wrists, as though restraints had recently been removed, and hidden beneath the blanket near his side rested a thick sealed envelope he had clutched even while unconscious. Evelyn had noticed it earlier while cleaning dried blood from his hands, but hospital policy and simple decency kept her from opening another person's possessions. Now she wondered why someone had risked dying to protect ordinary paper. The mercenary leader scanned every face with practiced efficiency before speaking in a voice so calm it somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. He announced they wanted only one man, promising everyone else would walk away unharmed if the hospital cooperated. No one believed him. Nurses exchanged frightened glances, family members instinctively pulled loved ones closer, and somewhere deeper inside the department a frightened infant began crying, the tiny voice echoing through hallways suddenly filled with armed strangers. 2 mercenaries swept toward the treatment rooms while another disabled security cameras with mechanical speed, moving like people who had rehearsed this exact operation dozens of times. One doctor attempted to protest that patients required immediate care, only to fall silent when the muzzle of a rifle rested against his chest. Time slowed into strange fragments. A heart monitor chirped steadily. Rain tapped against distant windows. And 4 pumps signaled that medication had finished infusing. Ordinary hospital sounds continued, stubborn reminders that illness and healing cared nothing about violence. Evelyn adjusted the unconscious patient's oxygen mask with gentle hands, checking his breathing even as boots thundered closer down the corridor. The younger nurse beside her whispered that they should hide, but Evelyn simply answered that frightened people still needed someone acting like a nurse. She had learned years earlier that calm could spread just as quickly as panic if someone chose not to surrender it. The mercenaries reached bed 7 moments later. One ripped open supply cabinets while another pulled back curtains with impatient force, searching beneath stretchers and inside storage rooms as though expecting hidden soldiers instead of frightened patients. Their leader walked more slowly. He studied everything. His eyes paused briefly on the unconscious man before shifting toward Evelyn. He asked for the patient's name. She answered truthfully that they did not know it yet. He demanded medical records. She explained admission paperwork was incomplete because saving a life always came before filling out forms. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them, his boots leaving muddy prints across the spotless floor, and for several long seconds neither of them spoke. Around them the emergency room seemed to stop breathing. Then his gaze drifted toward the sealed envelope beneath the blanket, almost hidden by folded sheets. His expression sharpened immediately. He ordered one of his men to retrieve it. Before the mercenary could move, the unconscious patient suddenly coughed, a weak painful sound followed by a desperate attempt to inhale. Instinct overpowered fear. Evelyn stepped between the armed man and the bed, adjusted the patient's airway, and stabilized the oxygen tubing without even glancing at the rifle pointed inches from her shoulder. She counted breaths beneath her own, checked the pulse again, and spoke softly to a man who could not answer, treating him exactly as she would any other patient. The room remained frozen. Even the mercenaries seemed momentarily uncertain what to do with someone who refused to acknowledge the threat standing beside her. The leader watched every movement with growing curiosity instead of anger. Most people begged. Some cried. Others tried bargaining for their lives. This nurse behaved as though compassion outranked intimidation. When the patient's breathing steadied again, Evelyn finally stood upright and faced the man holding the rifle. Her eyes settled for a brief instant on the faded tattoo wrapped around his wrist. Recognition flickered across her face almost too quickly to notice. She remembered seeing that symbol years ago under circumstances she had buried beneath countless night shifts and forgotten tragedies. Without raising her voice, without stepping backward, and without a trace of defiance, she quietly spoke a single sentence that no one else inside the emergency room understood. The mercenary leader's face strained of color, his grip loosened around the weapon, and for the first time since entering the hospital, genuine uncertainty replaced absolute control. The silence that followed seemed to stretch beyond the walls of the emergency department, until even the steady rhythm of heart monitors felt impossibly loud. None of the frightened patients understood why 6 armed mercenaries had suddenly stopped moving because of one quiet sentence spoken by an exhausted nurse, yet everyone sensed the balance of power had shifted in a way that rifles alone could not explain. The leader stared at Evelyn as though he were looking through years instead of across a hospital room, searching her face for certainty while memories he had locked away clawed their way back into the light. His men exchanged uncertain glances, waiting for orders that did not come. They had followed him through war zones, border crossings, and impossible missions, but they had never seen hesitation settle into his eyes. One finally stepped forward and demanded permission to seize the patient anyway. The leader lifted a single hand without looking away from Evelyn. The mercenaries stopped instantly. That tiny gesture told everyone something invisible had just become more powerful than fear. Evelyn slowly turned back toward the unconscious patient, checking the 4-line and adjusting the blanket as though the room contained nothing more threatening than another difficult night shift. Her heartbeat was fast, but her hands remained steady. Years earlier she had promised herself that if terror ever entered a place meant for healing, she would not allow it to change who she was. A hospital existed because every human life deserved a chance before judgment. That belief had carried her through pandemics, mass casualty nights, and the quiet grief of families hearing impossible news. It carried her now. The leader finally spoke, his voice lower than before. He asked where she had learned the words she had just spoken. Evelyn answered with a question of her own. She asked whether he still remembered the refugee clinic outside the mountains where wounded children had arrived faster than medicine could be unpacked. The man's jaw tightened. Images he had spent years trying to bury surfaced without mercy. A younger version of himself. Smoke drifting across broken buildings. Hunger. Exhaustion. A volunteer nurse kneeling beside a frightened child instead of running from gunfire. He remembered being wounded, anonymous, convinced he would die among strangers. He remembered a woman refusing to abandon patients despite incoming shells. He remembered her saying that people were never beyond saving while stitching a wound that should have ended his life. Until this moment he had believed that nurse had died with the rest of the humanitarian team. Evelyn saw recognition settle across his face before he ever admitted it aloud. Around them the emergency room remained suspended between catastrophe and hope. Doctors quietly continued treating critical patients whenever they could. One elderly woman reached across the aisle to hold the hand of a stranger because both of them needed someone to remind them they were still alive. A frightened teenage orderly silently guided two children behind a supply cabinet without drawing attention to himself. Courage was appearing everywhere, not loudly, but in small invisible decisions that refused to surrender compassion. One of the mercenaries lost patience. He marched toward bed 7, shoved a tray of instruments aside, and grabbed the sealed envelope from beneath the blanket. Before anyone could react, he tore it open. Thick documents spilled across the floor along with several photographs and a small encrypted flash drive. The photographs slid across polished tiles until one stopped beside Evelyn's shoe. She looked down. Villages reduced to ash. Civilians lined against walls. Military vehicles without identifying markings. Faces of children marked with dates. None of it belonged in ordinary medical paperwork. The mercenary who had opened the envelope frowned as he picked up another page. His confidence disappeared almost immediately. The documents were not payment records or classified contracts. They were evidence. Names. Financial transfers. Secret communications linking powerful officials, private military financiers, and organized massacres that had been blamed on innocent people. The unconscious patient had not been fleeing justice. He had been carrying it. One doctor slowly realized what he was seeing and instinctively reached for the papers, but another mercenary pushed him back. Even so, the damage had already been done. Several armed men had read enough to understand they had been sent not to eliminate a dangerous criminal but to silence the only surviving witness capable of exposing an operation that reached far beyond a single battlefield. The room fell into another terrible silence. This one felt different. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that arrives when certainty begins to collapse. The leader knelt beside the scattered documents and picked up one photograph with trembling fingers. In the corner of the image stood a younger version of himself wearing the insignia he had once believed represented honor. Behind him, almost hidden by smoke, was the same nurse now standing only a few feet away, carrying an injured little girl through falling debris. He had never known someone had captured that moment. Evelyn watched him study the picture without speaking. Some truths required silence before they could be heard. The other mercenaries slowly lowered their weapons, not completely, but enough for doubt to become visible. They had accepted lucrative contracts without asking difficult questions. They had convinced themselves they were professionals rather than participants. Now every page on the floor accused them without saying a single word. The leader looked toward the unconscious patient, and finally understood why so many powerful people wanted him dead before sunrise. He also understood why Evelyn had recognized the tattoo wrapped around his wrist. It was the faded emblem of a unit that no longer officially existed, a unit whose surviving members had spent years hiding from the consequences of decisions made by men sitting safely behind polished desks. Evelyn met his eyes one last time. She did not accuse him. She did not plead with him. She simply asked whether he intended to become the man who protected the truth, or the man who buried it forever. No one moved. No one breathed. Then the leader slowly removed the magazine from his rifle and let it fall onto the hospital floor with a metallic echo that seemed to shake every heart in the room. Before anyone could understand what that choice truly meant, alarms erupted outside the emergency entrance. Tires screeched across rain-soaked pavement, and dozens of headlights flooded the windows. The mercenaries had not been the only ones coming for the witness. A far more powerful force had just arrived. The glow of flashing blue and white lights poured through the rain-streaked windows, washing the emergency department in shifting bands of color that made every frightened face appear suspended between hope and disaster. No one knew whether the vehicles outside carried rescue or another wave of danger. The mercenaries instinctively reached for their weapons again, but their leader did not. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the unconscious man whose slow, measured breathing had somehow become the heartbeat of everyone inside the hospital. Evelyn listened carefully. Not to the sirens. Not to the shouting outside. She listened to the footsteps. Years of working night shifts had taught her that panic always had a rhythm, and these footsteps carried the confidence of people who expected no resistance because they believed the outcome had already been decided. The front doors burst open. Men in expensive tactical equipment swept inside with military precision, their uniforms clean, their movements disciplined, their insignias deliberately absent. They announced themselves as a government recovery team, demanded custody of the patient, and ordered everyone to remain where they stood. Their polished authority sounded convincing, but something about them felt colder than the mercenaries who had arrived before. They spoke of procedures while pointing rifles at nurses. They claimed to protect justice while ignoring the terrified families pressed against the walls. The leader of the mercenaries studied them for only a few seconds before quietly saying they were not there to recover evidence. They were there to erase it. One of the newcomers recognized him immediately and offered a final chance to complete the original contract. The amount of money mentioned was enough to change generations of a family's future. For a brief moment the room seemed to shrink around that impossible choice. Years of violence, loyalty, and survival stood on one side. A single wounded stranger and one stubborn nurse stood on the other. Evelyn said nothing. She simply remained beside her patient, one hand resting lightly on the bed rail as though reminding everyone why hospitals existed in the first place. The mercenary leader looked at her and remembered a sentence she had spoken years ago while treating frightened civilians beneath the roar of distant artillery. She had told him that courage was not measured by the lives a person could take but by the lives they refused to abandon. At the time he had dismissed those words as the hopeful thinking of someone untouched by war. Standing in the emergency department, surrounded by frightened strangers, he realized they had survived inside him long after every battlefield had disappeared. He slowly laid his rifle on the floor. One by one, the other mercenaries watched him. Some hesitated. One closed his eyes before removing the magazine from his weapon. Another carefully placed his pistol beside the first rifle. Then another. And another. Within moments the polished hospital floor held a row of abandoned weapons instead of raised ones. The armed recovery team stared in disbelief. They had prepared for a firefight. They had not prepared for conscience. Their commander shouted that every man standing there would be hunted as a traitor. No one moved. Fear remained in the room, but it no longer controlled it. The commander raised his own weapon toward the unconscious witness. Before his finger could tighten on the trigger, several of the former mercenaries stepped directly into the line of fire. They did not fire back. They simply stood between the rifle and the hospital bed. It was the first unarmed wall they had ever chosen to become. Hospital security officers, local police, and investigators who had quietly followed the suspicious convoy finally entered through a side corridor, having received an anonymous transmission moments earlier containing copies of every document from the envelope. The evidence no longer existed in only one place. It could not disappear with one death. Faced with overwhelming witnesses, recorded surveillance from nearby buildings, and officers already securing the exits, the recovery team slowly realized the mission had failed before they ever walked inside. Their commander lowered his weapon with the bitter expression of a man watching years of carefully hidden crimes collapse in a single night. Handcuffs replaced rifles. Orders became arrests. The emergency room, which had begun the night as a place of terror, slowly remembered it was a place of healing. Doctors rushed back to interrupted surgeries. Nurses comforted children who were only now beginning to cry after holding their fear inside for far too long. An elderly patient quietly thanked one of the former mercenaries for shielding her granddaughter without ever learning his name. He could not find words to answer. Evelyn returned to the unconscious witness, adjusted the blanket that had slipped during the chaos, and checked his pulse once more. It was stronger than before. She smiled almost invisibly. Saving lives had always happened one heartbeat at a time. The mercenary leader approached her with empty hands. Years seemed to have settled across his face in only a few hours. He apologized, not because he expected forgiveness, but because truth deserved to be spoken even when it changed nothing. Evelyn listened without interruption. When he finished, she simply nodded. Some wounds required justice. Others required time. Both could begin in the same moment. As dawn slowly painted the rain clouds with pale gold, Investigators carried away boxes of evidence while ambulances resumed arriving with ordinary emergencies that knew nothing about the extraordinary night that had just unfolded. The hospital did not celebrate. It simply continued doing what it had always done. Healing resumed. Lives moved forward. Quiet replaced violence not because evil had vanished, but because ordinary people had refused to surrender their humanity. Before leaving to check on another patient, Evelyn glanced once toward the man who had chosen to lower his weapon instead of raising it. She knew the road ahead would be difficult for him, filled with trials, testimony, and consequences that no act of courage could erase. Yet she also knew something deeper had changed forever. A person could spend years learning how to destroy another human being, but it took only one honest decision to begin becoming human again. The words would later spread far beyond the hospital, repeated by investigators, doctors, and families who had survived that unforgettable night. The bravest hands are not always the ones that hold a weapon, but the ones that refuse to let fear decide who deserves to live. Long after the headlines faded and the evidence reshaped powerful institutions, the people who had been inside that emergency room remembered something else entirely. They remembered an exhausted night nurse who never raised her voice, never reached for a weapon, and somehow disarmed armed men by reminding them of the people they had almost forgotten they could still become. And as another ordinary night shift eventually arrived, with fresh patients walking through the same automatic doors seeking hope instead of certainty, her footsteps echoed softly through the corridor like a quiet promise that compassion never needed permission to be courageous. If this story stayed with you, carry that courage into one ordinary moment of your own, because the smallest act of kindness can become the turning point in someone else's life. And if you believe quiet humanity still has the power to change the world, there will always be another story waiting just beyond the next door.